Welcome to the New England and New York Real Estate Journal podcast. I'm your host, Rick Kaplan, and my guest today is Mitchell Korbey, and he is with Herrick, Feinstein LLP. Hello, Mitchell. How are you?
I'm well, Rick. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. Tell me a little bit about your journey to get where you are today.
Okay. It was a bit circuitous, but I'll give you the brief version. I began my journey as an urban planner, and I loved being an urban planner, and still do. But I'm more than just an urban planner. I'm a lawyer as well. I started off my career after graduating from graduate school with a graduate degree in urban planning from Cornell in Massachusetts, and I was the city planner for Beverly, Massachusetts, city north of Boston. And had a great time. Do you really? Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Great little city, but definitely a city, a place that was diverse and interesting, had lots of different kinds of land uses. And I was there during the mid 80s at a time when there was a lot of growth in Massachusetts. You may remember the phrase, the Massachusetts miracle, lots of activity. And so it was a good time and a fun time to be an urban planner. But I left Beverly and came to New York looking to meet new people and be in a big city and experience a big city environment. And I know it sounds awkward, but I answered an ad in the New York Times. That's how you applied for a job back in the, at that point, the late 80s and early 90s. And I came to New York not knowing the city very well, but landed in the bureaucracy at the New York City Planning Department, the deep state, if you will, at city planning. And I mean that only in a very positive way, because the city planning department to this day is known as New York's smartest. They were then and they are now. Not to elevate myself, but I joined the group and had a great experience there. And thankfully was in the right place at the right time and managed to have a number of promotions. And eventually rose by the mid 90s to be the planning director for Brooklyn. And oh my goodness, what a fabulous job to be the planning director for the Brooklyn division. My deputy was Regina Meyer. I had a great team there of wonderful urban planners, including Winston Von Engel and Purnima Kapoor, both of whom went on to higher positions at city planning. And it was a great run, and it was an interesting time to be in government. That's when we rezoned Dumbo. That's when Williamsburg Greenpoint became Williamsburg Greenpoint that we know of it today. It's when Brooklyn emerged as the brand that it is today. Not to say that it wasn't a lively place before, but it became and grew and evolved during that critical time period when Mayor Giuliani was mayor, and then into the Bloomberg administration. But I was appointed to be a commissioner on the Zoning Board of Appeals, the BSA, and sometimes called no such agency like the NSA. It's the city version of a obscure but very powerful little agency involved in issuing zoning variances and appeals. So I was fortunate enough to be a commissioner for a number of years, and I went to law school at night. And then in 2003, I left city service with my law degree in hand and joined my firm, Herrick Feinstein. And I've been here since 2003, and I'm now a partner and thankfully head of our zoning group. And in a manner of speaking, I did what I did before, which is to say, interpret and help folks understand the zoning resolution, figure out what it means, what you can build and what you can't build. And I maintain, Rick, of course I would say this, that the first question you should ask when you're considering investing in real estate, when you're considering issuing a loan, when you're interested in buying a piece of property, renting a piece of property, the first thing you should ask is, how is my property zoned? What can I do with it? What will happen in the neighborhood? What will evolve in the community that I'm investing in, buying in, issuing a loan in, whatever the case may be? And so zoning, of course, I think is extremely important. Understanding the rules and how they work is important, as are non-zoning things that affect land use, historic districts. I like to say, and it's true, that 30% of Manhattan is either a historic district or a landmark building. I'm speaking to you from one now. My offices are at 2 Park Avenue. That's a significant amount of Manhattan that's part of a historic district and part of the jurisdiction of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And the rules are changing all the time. And so keeping up on them, understanding the changes, interpreting them, watching them, is critical. There were many zoning changes during the de Blasio administration. And of course, today, very, very critical changes being proposed, known as collectively the City of Yes. Some of the City of Yes has been adopted already. City of Yes in terms of economic growth and development, but the City of Yes now that's before the City Council, which is the last step in the rezoning process, is an important set of legislative actions. All zoning has to be adopted by the City Council. It's not done by executive fiat or by the mayor or by the planning department. They propose, they study, and suggest and urge, but ultimately it's the City Council, of course, 51 members, that vote on and adopt, new zoning regulations.
So that's it. That's, that's a
Yeah,
very good.
I also play the trumpet, and I teach part-time. I'm a professor adjunct professor at Hunter College, where I have a great group of graduate students in urban planning, and I also teach at alternating semesters at Brooklyn Law School.
Well, you have a pretty impressive journey that you have taken here so far.
Wow.
And you mentioned Beverly, Mass, which, like I said, I am familiar with Beverly.
Okay.
I had a cousin that lived there in Beverly Farms,
Yes,
and they had a house that I don't know if you ever heard of it. It was called the Pool House.
the Pool House. I don't think so, but I knew Beverly Farms very well. Beautiful part of the Massachusetts Gold Coast.
So they had a drive. I remember as a kid because he's long gone, but you used to drive into his garage and he had there was it rotated, the floor rotated. So it turned the car.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's something you don't forget. That's
No.
interesting.
Yeah, it was an interesting house. But let's get back to you, Mitchell.
Yeah.
So you were an urban planner. That must have been a very interesting job, especially in Brooklyn.
Yes.
So you take these areas, these parts of the city, like Brooklyn or Queens or any of those parts. Is there any real major changes that you can, as an urban planner, put in place? Because they're so condensed, they're small areas.
Right. Well, it's a good question, Rick, because you think of the city as one that changes slowly, if at all. Some neighborhoods seem to be the same now. The reality is, many communities have undergone a lot of modifications. Just take Long Island City in Queens, for example. Long Island City, back maybe 20 years ago, and a little bit earlier, 30 years ago, was a headquarters of manufacturing, lots of activity. Um, and then a lot of that ceased. A lot of the manufacturing activity there moved south, moved abroad, and then by the 1980s, Long Island City had really ceased to become a manufacturing center. And then certainly as the 90s evolved, there were a lot of vacancies. Lots of land in Long Island City was vacant. Properties used for automobile type uses or parking lots. There was a lot of underutilization of land in Long Island City, notwithstanding the fact that it had fabulous transit access. It was also sort of a hub center of sorts in a way, but it was not a place where you could live because the zoning there was manufacturing. Manufacturing zones in New York do not permit residential use. So in 2001, at long last, the city recognized that the area ought to be rezoned, and Long Island City's zoning was changed. And what happened was a metamorphosis and a tremendous transformation of Long Island City. And of course, since 2001, one residential building after another has gone up, and Long Island City has become a vibrant, thriving residential and mixed-use community, taking advantage of the wonderful transit access right into Manhattan, one stop away. Now, since 2001, there hasn't been a rezoning of Long Island City again, and it's time to think about that. But it is an example of a neighborhood in Queens that has just undergone tremendous change since 10 or 15 years ago. Similarly, I mentioned earlier Williamsburg Greenpoint, which back in the 90s, as late as the 90s, Williamsburg Greenpoint also had a number of vacant sites and vacant warehouse buildings and vacant loft buildings that have begun to be occupied, in some cases illegally, by artists and young people. City recognized, and I was there in the Brooklyn office at the time, that the area ought to be rezoned, to recognize what was happening on the ground and to recognize the future. And Williamsburg Greenpoint transformed as well into an exciting place where folks live and work, with a waterfront that's remarkable, that has a lot of access along the shorefront. And so these neighborhoods, and there are many others in New York, have changed an awful lot as the city has grown. Brooklyn is now the size of Chicago, which is remarkable. For many years, it was the size of Philadelphia, and now it continues to grow and change and evolve. And it's become a place, as I said, that is a place to live and work, with many neighborhoods that have changed over the years. So those are just two examples in the outer boroughs.
So you went from planning to now you're an attorney. Now you're handling zoning.
Yes.
That's pretty much your line is the zoning.
Yes.
So zoning, you must have seen a lot of changes in zoning rules and laws since, especially after the pandemic.
Right.
I would think.
Yeah. Well, there was a recognition that the pandemic accelerated certain trends. People were working at home before the pandemic. There was live work before the pandemic, and certainly that has come to the forefront after the pandemic. Before the pandemic, retail was beginning to shift. Lord & Taylor closed down before the pandemic, and that trend has certainly accelerated. How are we going to shop in the future? What is the future of retail in cities like New York? The outer boroughs and neighborhoods in the outer boroughs were changing before, and they continue to change. So the zoning does need to reflect this change. The zoning needs to reflect this evolution. And there are times when the zoning lags behind change, when the marketplace and when people move to a place, effectively begin to change it, and the zoning regulations are lagging behind. Well, this administration and this planning department and Dan Garodnick, who runs it, are making a real effort to catch up and to think ahead and to make sure that we plan, for the future, particularly on the housing front. New York City has a vacancy rate that has a 60-year low of 1.4%. People are spending much more of their income towards rent than they should, and particularly folks that are lower income families. People are spending 40%, almost half the folks in New York who rent are spending 40% of their income on rent. And these numbers need to change, and we need to produce more housing. We need to build at least 50,000 units a year, and we're not doing that. So how do we do that? How do we keep pace? And the answer in part is the zoning resolution. Now, it's not all about zoning. Zoning is not the field of dreams. Zone it and they will come. Doesn't quite work that way because lots of other things come into play. Also, we're not going to solve this housing issue in an election cycle. It's not something you can do during one mayoral administration. We didn't reduce the crime rate to historic lows. And by the way, it continues to be very, very low, the crime rate in New York, particularly on a per capita basis. We didn't do that in a mayoral administration, began under Mayor Dinkins and continued under Mayor Giuliani. These sorts of urban issues and these sorts of fundamental policy things take time to address. And I think this administration has got something great in store with the city of yes. And I hope it doesn't become the city of maybe.
Well, like you were saying, housing, it's not just an issue in New York. This is an issue around the world, around the country. And I've interviewed quite a few developers from the New York area, New Jersey area that have done work in New York. And, one of the things that they talk about is conversion. You've got a lot of office buildings that aren't being used anymore.
Right.
The conversion rate, but that has to be part of the zoning.
Yeah. Now,
where
it's
you
a
come in.
critical point. Yeah, no, it's a critical point, Rick, and thank you for raising it because we have scores of office buildings that are Class B office buildings, truthfully like the one I'm in, that many, not so much this one suffers from a vacancy rate, but many of them do. Many of our older office buildings are, largely vacant. What to do about that? And the fact that exists in the midst of a housing challenge presents an opportunity. Can we take these buildings and give them a different life? Now, We've been doing this in Lower Manhattan for many years. 30,000 people live in Lower Manhattan because we allow buildings to be converted in that part of the city. We've got a 24/7 community in Lower Manhattan, thousands and thousands of new housing units over the past 25 years. Just take the old AIG building on Pine Street, gorgeous Art Deco tower that was once AIG's headquarters. When AIG left that building after the Lehman collapse, the building was vacant. What do you do with an office tower that's that big, that's that old? You're not going to put a new set of office uses in there. It's unlikely. Law firms and architecture firms are not going to occupy a building like that when there are other choices. Instead, that building has been converted and now is home to hundreds of new residents. It's an example, and there are many, many of them in Lower Manhattan, of how new life gets breathed into old buildings. We recycle buildings in New York, and it's a wonderful thing. It's, by the way, great for the environment. We don't, and density is great for the environment. People living in closer quarters is good. It's more efficient. In any event, the fact that this has happened in Lower Manhattan is a wonderful thing. It's breathed life and vitality, once again, into older buildings that would otherwise not have that life. And so we need to do that beyond Lower Manhattan. And the city of Yes and the planning department's new changes will do that, and they propose to do that in larger areas of the city, and in many cases throughout the city. And to do it not just for older office buildings, but office buildings that were built in the 70s and even the 80s that are also underutilized today. Convert them, allow them to be converted to residential occupancy. Now, that won't be easy. It won't be easy because it's expensive to convert these buildings. It's a challenge to do it. These buildings weren't designed for residential occupancy. So your point, building conversions is a wonderful concept. It's been done before. We can do it, and we ought to be doing it in other places in the city.
Yeah, see, that was what I was going to. The next question was, how can they afford to do that conversion? Because a lot of those buildings are not designed for residential.
Right.
And that's one of the things that the developers come across, that it's too costly to do that conversion.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if the city, when they say yes, does that mean they're going to get yes and come up with some of the cash to change that, convert that building?
Well, Rick, again, it's not all about zoning. We need to have other things, as you know, to unlock this. And one thing that's helpful is the state legislature a few months ago adopted new property tax relief. The old 421A program expired, but we have two new programs. One of them is the 467M program. I don't know why, but these programs sound like sports cars to me. 485X is the residential. 467M is a tax relief program for converted buildings. So that does provide a certain amount of relief, and I think that's going to be helpful. But it is true, certainly, that not all buildings are easily convertible. Those with really big floor plates, what do you do with the middle of the building, which can't have windows, which you need for apartments? So that's a major challenge for large floor plate buildings. And as you say, buildings that weren't designed for residential use aren't going to have the plumbing, within them and all the rest. So these challenges are going to exist. But that doesn't mean we don't try to unlock it where we can. And again, it's worked well in other parts of Manhattan. No reason why it can't work in certain circumstances elsewhere. And I think we ought to do that. And the new plan will enable that.
Now, changing these zoning laws, now you also have an issue of emergency services. You have schooling. The public school system has to adjust to new residents that are moving into these apartments or condos, whatever they convert to. So there's a lot of other zoning issues you run into, I would think.
It's true. And again, it's an important point. We can't just create zoning and leave it at that and expect that we're going to result in new housing and a higher quality of life. We need to build communities, and we need to build the community institutions and allow them to thrive around the new development. So as we rezone the city, we do need to think about an environmental review process. And in tandem with a rezoning goes an environmental impact statement, which assesses those kinds of impacts. which makes sure that we have ample schools, which makes sure that the infrastructure keeps pace. And the current zoning package has, of course, an environmental review that goes along with it. But that by itself isn't always enough. We have to be sensitive about our local houses of worship, make sure we have strong communities, and we certainly have to do what we need to do with the school system to make sure it has the resources it needs, and where necessary, build new schools. When Fourth Avenue was rezoned during the de Blasio administration, all those new buildings along Fourth Avenue and Park Slope and Sunset Park that have gone up and are still going up have resulted in the need for new school seats. And a new school has been built in Park Slope along Fourth Avenue. So it's an important thing we need to think about. In addition to doing these citywide zoning changes, which will provide for more affordable housing, which will create greater density and allow for more buildings to be converted, we need to do more neighborhood rezonings. I mentioned Long Island City. We've got to rezone Long Island City a second time. We've got to rezone areas of Manhattan that continue to be zoned for manufacturing where there's no manufacturing. Areas like the Garment District, truthfully, areas north of Madison Square Park that inexplicably are zoned for manufacturing that needn't be zoned that way. Again, you can't live in a manufacturing zone, but when there's no manufacturing, the reason why you have the district no longer exists, so it ought to be modified. We're doing that right now in the Bronx along the new Metro North lines, and that's a wonderful thing. But there are other places that we can rezone in the city. Jamaica is being studied for that purpose, and large areas of Jamaica could use the strength and vitality that comes with getting the regulations out of the way and trying to build a stronger and better community.
Now, what about the greenscape area? You know, a lot of cities have, or even a lot of urban areas around the country, they had to bring more of the like a park.
Yeah.
You know, in parks with the green grass that can walk around, kids can play in, trees that are good for the pollution in the area. Is that something that is now going into effect in the New York area?
Well, it's interesting, but again, when we do a rezoning, we have to do an environmental review, and that oftentimes does result in impacts on open space because we don't have enough open space in many of our neighborhoods. And that means that both developers and the city have to create new or support older open spaces. It also means that when we rezone the Gowanus Canal, which was done recently, you create open spaces on either side of the canal. There'll be an esplanade that's actually under construction now along both sides of the canal, opening up what was once an industrial waterway that was, let's say, pretty awful, and transforming it into a new community that will eventually be quite clean. God willing, my grandchildren will be swimming in the Gowanus Canal. Maybe my great-grandchildren. In any event, the canal is increasingly a great place to live, and it's not only much cleaner, but it's more vibrant. And again, open spaces, green spaces are being created in conjunction with a rezoning that required these esplanades, walkways along the canal, that required publicly accessible open space. So yes, I mean, these are the kinds of things we need to think about as we do new projects in the city. Speaking of which, you've heard, I'm sure, about the plan for a casino license in New York. We ought to be thinking about these things as well, in my view, when we move forward with new plans for casinos, whichever one moves forward eventually. Issues about affordable housing and open space ought to be part of these kinds of decisions. So when we do these zoning plans, whether the city does them or the private sector does them, those kinds of impacts are things that have to be assessed and resolved, including, as you say, the one that has to do with open space. We need more open space in New York. It's good for the environment, and it's good for the obviously to facilitate clean air and recreation.
It's also good for the city. I mean, the city itself, you don't want it to look like a rundown, the bad neighborhood looking when people walk through it or people come to visit. I mean, I think there's something about going into New York City and seeing some of the architecture that was built, oh God, 100 years ago. And that's still very, very interesting to see. But people also want to mix that with some contemporary stuff as well.
Mhm.
And you're seeing that a lot around the whole country, where some of these older cities, they kind of gel all that into one mix.
Right.
And it's I like it. I like the look of that. I
Right.
mean, sometimes it's a little overkill. They put in too contemporary, but I don't know if that's something that you can prevent. But uh, architects can do incredible things.
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes good design is in the eye of the person looking at it and the
Right.
beholder. So what you may think is beautiful, I may say, oh, yeah. But high quality design is high quality design. And then, of course, historic preservation is important. As you say, being able to appreciate older architecture, older buildings, and to preserve them where appropriate. And we have a lot of historic districts in New York, as I alluded to at the outset, and that's a good thing. At the same time, we need to be sensitive about um, what areas deserve to be landmarked and what areas are more appropriate for change. And I think we've got the right balance in New York. We would not ever want to lose a Soho, and we would not ever want to lose a Brooklyn Heights, and we would not ever want to lose the gorgeous architecture along West End Avenue and the Upper West Side. So it's appropriate we have these great, historic districts in the city. At the same time, we need to help incentivize development. And one of the things that the City of Yes zoning package will do is it will make it easier to transfer rights away from a landmark. So today, if you have a landmark building, you can take the development rights that are left over. You can't usually use them on the building because it's landmark, and you can transfer them across the street to another site that's not landmarked. Well, that sounds like a great thing. Sadly, today, you have to go through a 2-year-long special permit process to do that. It's not as of right. It's very difficult, cumbersome, time-consuming, and expensive. I think there've only been about 10 applications in the past 20 years since the rule exists. It's silly. What we ought to do is allow people to transfer their rights off of a landmark much easier. And this current package of proposals, known collectively as the City of Yes, will remove the special permit and make it by what's called the certification, a fairly straightforward process that doesn't require umpteen public hearings and 2 years long worth of review. And there's no reason for all of that, review. You're, if you will, preserving the landmark by making sure that the development rights are pertinent to it, leave it, and go outside, the landmark. So there are things that we can do to support our landmark buildings and historic districts, and at the same time encourage development.
Yeah, I mean, something like that will be very discouraging for a developer to go to attempt to try to do a project in there. So, I mean, and it also, it limits to how many type of developers it will attract, because it has to be a developer that has the deep pockets to withstand that wait time,
Exactly. Yeah, you've got to have a strong stomach and deep pockets, as you say, to deal with the idea that it takes such a long time to go through the process. So instead of that lengthy process, the proposal, which is a Christmas tree with many ornaments, but one of the ornaments is this, and I think it's something that is very wise and would should go part way towards resolving some of the issues that we have. Something else that is another nuance, right, is this rear yard. You've probably heard that every residential building in New York has a rear yard. They have to have a 30-foot rear yard. Well, that may not be necessary in your higher density areas. We've got plenty of light and air with something that might be less than that. And in a way, you can help produce more flexibility in the zoning by allowing a reduction for shorter buildings to 20 feet. So the point really is that there are many things that we can do with the regulations that help and can help stimulate new development in a way that's not going to harm neighborhoods, in a way that's not going to change the character of the city or our communities, but at the same time will help produce new housing. And we need to produce new housing. we need to keep the city strong and vibrant. We need to keep the city growing. We all want that. We want New York to be a strong, vibrant, and as you say, an attractive place to live.
Now, someone was telling me, and I'm not sure if I have this right. It was an old Navy yard.
Yes.
Was it Hudson Yards? Oh,
Well, there's the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is an industrial business district, which is thriving. And then there's Hudson Yards, which of course is west of the Penn Station area, which was a former rail yard that's been transformed into a new office and mixed use community.
oh, okay. Well, someone was telling me that there's also a lot of like restaurants, and I'm not sure which one this is.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it could be Hudson Yards, which of course, not that many years ago was a series of rail tracks exposed, and now has been decked over. And of course, the office equivalent of downtown Boston is now in Hudson Yards, and those are Class A office buildings, which I understand are doing very well. And we don't have the same vacancy issues as we have in other parts of the city there. And yes, many new restaurants and night spots have moved into the area to help it become a community and help it become a neighborhood.
But that had to be an issue of rezoning a whole area at some point. Yeah.
Yes. And that was during the Bloomberg era and the era of Dan Doctoroff, who did an amazing series of things in New York, including, importantly, Hudson Yards. And it wasn't easy. It required a lot of political back and forth with the city council, because once again, the city council is responsible for all rezonings. And the speaker at the time, Chris Quinn, was heavily involved in negotiations with Mayor Bloomberg and Dan Doctoroff over the rezoning of Hudson Yards.
Well, Mitchell, I think we've said a lot here.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to say.
But yeah, and it's all very interesting because, everything is evolving, and it's not just in New York, it's all over. It's just things are changing.
Yeah.
And now you have to adapt to all these changes.
Right.
New York and Boston and New Jersey, especially with the new, what they call rising sea levels and things of that nature, is new changes that have to come into play with that. And I'm sure there's a lot of issues of changing zoning because of that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
absolutely. Yeah.
But now I know that you're on the wheel making those changes, so I feel secure.
Well, there's a lot of folks who are steering the ship, including great people at the planning department. But I appreciate that, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you about these issues.
It's a pleasure talking with you. We're talking with Mitchell Korbey of Herrick Feinstein LLP, and again, thank you for coming on the show. And if someone wanted to get a hold of you, do you have the website for?
Sure. So my law firm, which is a robust full service law firm, including a great real estate department, it's it's herrick.com. It's easy to find. If you just Google HERRICK, you can find them, and that'll lead you to me. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn and all the usual places. So I'm happy to help answer zoning questions and get you interested in housing and the city of yes.
Great. Thank you, Mitchell. It's been great talking
pleasure.
with you. You're listening to the NEREJ NYREJ podcast, and I'm your host, Rick Kaplan. Until next time.